Obsidian's co-founder turned freelance scribe on what the next big things in narrative in games are, working in other genres and the outer worlds. PlayDiaries.com's Johnny Cullen had a 2-hour interview with video game legend Chris Avellone and proceeded to publish several articles centered around it. I would like to express my thoughts on this one, but for the sake of the video's length, I'm going to summarize sections of the article. A link to the full piece will be in the description box below. You'll also find links to my Twitter and Discord server that was set up due to popular demand. For a 2-hour interview, I wonder if the interviewer had a recording device on hand. I would guess he did, but regardless, the man's a writer, not a podcaster. It's no secret that I, and I would think my subscribers, are big fans of Chris Avellone, so who would I be to not cover this? As far as I'm concerned, he's the best the industry has. I hope that one day he can get the Warren Spector treatment. It doesn't have to be John Romero calling him up, but Mr. Avellone has, in my opinion, earned the right to make a game that's entirely his vision. First, getting the itch to write for a living. He talks about how he started out with pen and paper tabletop games. He enjoyed game mastering, and since that covered writing modules, adventures, and character books, the logical next step was to be a full-time writer since that's what he was by default. He loved writing, but writing for video games was something that hadn't occurred to him at first. It wasn't until Interplay got his D&D division that he saw a connection. He initially saw it as an opportunity for a steady paycheck, but once he started doing it, he fell in love with it, and smoothly transitioned into writing for video games. I've had a thought recently. I never had the chance to play Dungeons & Dragons or any tabletop RPG for that matter. I'd like to familiarize myself with it first, but if I ever get to play it, I think I'd enjoy being a dungeon master. I wonder if being a good dungeon master would naturally translate into being a good video game writer. On the surface at least, they seem similar. The game mechanics are set up and you're writing a narrative around them. But it wouldn't be out of the question, I don't think, for a game to change, add, or remove certain mechanics due to the story during development. On the difference between pen and paper and video games writing, he says that for digital games you need to be a lot more detailed with your narrative because you have to account for every single choice and consequence, and every action the player might do in an environment. While in tabletop you can paint broad strokes of a city or character interaction and trust the game master to handle it from there. With a video game you have to account for everything in the game and everything the player might do, and if you don't, then quality assurance is going to find a lot more bugs, he says. Employing the programming term if then else, he expresses that you should apply that principle with characters from the perspective of player convenience. For example, and he states that this is a bad example, if you have a quest giver and he tells you to go get 10 wolf pelts, but you already have them in your inventory, there should be a dialogue option there for that situation, instead of the player having to restart the conversation. For the most part, it seems that developers have learned this lesson. But for those of us who've been playing video games for a long enough time, we've seen examples of the former, of having to end the conversation with an NPC, or this could just have been a simple bug, even having to leave the area and reload the cell for the NPC to realize that you've already completed the parameters of the quest. But it can also be enjoyable to see an NPC's reaction on a second playthrough, where you just complete all the quests before they're given to you. The developers would have to see that possibility and write and record voice lines and such for it. But I also very much enjoy things like this where the developers take this same sort of player predictive design outside of dialogue as well. Those of you who have played games like Spec Ops: The Line would know what I mean. Which, as of the publisher of this video, you can get for $1 on Humble Bundle. More than worth it. I would highly recommend you get it. It's a great game. I wouldn't want to spoil anything, but as an example, there's a moment where the game gives you every incentive and seemingly just tells you that you're supposed to open fire on a crowd of people. But instead, there are other options that the game doesn't directly tell you about that you can do. Also, yes, the example that Chris gave of a quest where you collect 10 wolf pelts was a good way to easily explain what he was saying, but for a game it's a bad example. Please, no more go get my chicken quests. The reason Dragon Age Inquisition bored me to tears is because I made the mistake of playing The Witcher 3 right before playing it. But while The Witcher 3 gets a lot of positive reception for its quest, it's not like it hasn't been done before. Fallout New Vegas is also filled with compelling side quests. And who wrote Fallout New Vegas? How he plots out narrative and story. Chris wants a brief outline on what the story will consist of. From developers, he also wants the overall vision of the game. He asks questions like, what do you want the player to be experiencing on a high level, like a survival horror? Is it open world? Crafting? What is that? What do you want to do that's different with this experience, or notable about this experience, or similar to some other experience? Before asking about anything related to narrative and lore, he wants to read the system design documentation because he wants to know the gameplay loop and construct a narrative that helps support it.
You must have noticed as you fought across all these planets, killing hundreds, only to become more and more powerful. Why do you think that was?
As an example, he brings up Fallout New Vegas and its faction politics. Joining or alienating different factions was a core part of the gameplay loop, so you'd have to design a narrative that would incentivize players to join these factions and consequences associated with angering them.
How interesting. You're the profligate courier who's been of some assistance to the Legion. The eyes of the mighty Kaisar are upon you. He admires your accomplishments and bestows upon you the exceptional gift of his mark. Any crimes you may have perpetrated against the Legion are hereby forgiven. Kaisar will not extend this mercy a second time.
You're the courier who caused so much trouble for my Legion, and yet you dare come before me. The garrison I established at Nelson has been wiped out. Years of meticulous scheming to place a mole at Camp McCarran. Wasted. So tell me this, because I really want to know. I am feared, with good reason. But you, of all people, dare to come here and stand before me, the mighty Kaisar. What were you thinking?
The next step will be to determine an all-encompassing phrase that people might use to describe the game, a phrase that people might use to quickly summarize the game. He gives an example of, oh, it's Bioshock with dinosaurs. The hook of the game, basically. With all this, he goes off and tries to write a one-page story summary with very little details. Then it's discussed, and then he writes a 4-pager with more details of regions and locations of the game world, and begins development on region design documents. He says, quote, "We make sure that when we do those regions, we try and keep it within budget of how long it takes the environment art and level designers to construct each level so that we're actually being scope conscious right from the beginning." End quote. That makes him sound almost like a producer as well. It sounds awfully fiscally responsible. I like that. A good man to have on a crowd-funded project, and yes, he's worked on several. He expressed that from there they keep going until near the end of the production, where they have all the content, at which point they start editing by deciding what's working and what isn't, which elements can be cut out of the game to strengthen it, or what just isn't working. I wonder if this is something he learned or expanded upon after working on KOTOR 2. It's not like it was his first game, or the last game where a lot needed to be cut out for various reasons. So maybe KOTOR 2 just stretched that to an extreme. What difference does genre make to the process? There should be a research period, he says. With Dying Light 2, that was him working on a game where zombies are heavily a part of the lore. It's generally a good idea to consume other zombie-related media to see what's being done with them and what's already been done with them. That way you can better construct stories and quest plot lines that either haven't been done before or have, but you can apply your own twist to it, or improve upon it in some way. As for Star Wars, you're focusing on one franchise in order to see what's being done, what could be done, which themes keep repeating themselves, and so on, in order to make interesting characters. I like that a lot, and it's kinda how I approach the YouTube videos. Some of you may have suggested a video idea to me and heard me say that someone's already uploaded that before. Technically, that isn't the entire story. If it hasn't been done, then I'll do it. If it has been done, then there has to be some kind of way for me to improve on it, or put my own spin on it. You can recycle things, otherwise every first-person shooter would be accused of ripping off Wolfenstein 3D. The research process of Star Wars and lore approval compared to things like Fallout. He says that after reading over 100 Star Wars comics and books, and watched the TV shows and all the films multiple times, including the Christmas special, and then you start writing, by that point you'll know the lore of the universe, and should know your plot points of the stories you want to tell in that universe. When you approach it like that, he says there usually aren't any problems. With KOTOR 2, they only received 5 or 6 notes back from LucasArts, and it was minor comments like character's name being misspelled or Deveronian's horns being too long. He attributes this to all the research they did. LucasArts must have been able to see how it all fit because of it. Research goes a long way. From the outside looking in, I guess we'd say that with the new canon having less material, the research should be easier in comparison to the old expanded universe. I can't find the article, but I remember a report about there being slightly different challenges now with Disney in charge though. They seem to want to micromanage what goes into the lore a lot more than LucasArts. on if the lore approval process is easier in comparison with a franchise like Fallout. Chris says that Fallout has what he describes as lore landmines. The Enclave is given as an example of a lore landmine where getting approval will be difficult due to the importance of the Enclave. They exist in any franchise you work with. New Vegas had a somewhat indirect Enclave presence, and that was okay. But having them be a bigger focus on the story probably would not have gotten approved because of how big of a focus they were on the East Coast at the time. I guess we can thank Bethesda for that one. Although many have gone and pointed out the lore inconsistencies on Bethesda's part. The one that comes to mind is the quest in Fallout 4 where the ghoul child that's supposedly been stuck inside a refrigerator for over 200 years. Some may say that Fallout 4 was one giant lore landmine, a lore atom bomb if you will. According to Chris, the approval process for Star Wars was easier than Fallout, but that isn't to say that Fallout was very strenuous. There's just certain things concerning the technology, factions, and connections between East and West Coast that needed to be handled with care. The following happens with Star Wars 2, where they can't include a certain planet or character because there was something else being worked on that involved them. It makes perfect sense. Although I think he's still talking about LucasArts Star Wars, not Disney. I'm not sure if that was something he had to worry about with his contributions to Jedi Fallen Order. The possibility of going back to a studio full-time and how he's able to handle things such as work-life balance. He says that freelance work wasn't his first choice, but his parents are getting older, and thus this offers him the freedom to take care of things and travel as he pleases. But he does enjoy it. He can go back to working an in-house job, but only if circumstances change. But considering the circumstances, the change probably wouldn't be a positive. But if it did, then he would consider going back full-time. On maintaining a decent work-life balance, he says that he lives to write. Quote, "A work-life balance for me is I get to do what I love doing. And it just so happens to be a job that also can sustain me. But I would be doing it anyway, even if I wasn't getting paid just because I enjoy writing." End quote. That's the dream right there, ladies and gentlemen. The goal of never having to work a day in your life because your work is what you enjoy. I'm working towards that right now. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. Quote, "Being more of a producer or having to do a ton of management stuff is only fulfilling if you actually have the power to be a manager. And as a writer, I definitely have the power to make the writing and the story and the voice acting as strong as I can make it, and there's not many barriers to that. Now that I have the freedom to manage my time for the most part, there's not a lot of unnecessary production meetings. There's not a lot of drama." He says that working at a studio came with having to attend countless meetings that made it near impossible to get any writing done during the day. So instead he found himself waiting until everyone left at night. What he would suggest for all writers is to figure out your own paces. For him it was to remove all distractions. No phones, no texting, no social media. Twitter shouldn't be anywhere near you. Cut those out and you'll discover that there's a lot more hours in the day. At least for him, the amount of writing he got done increased and it was cleaner and more focused. Personally, I do what the memes suggest a lot of people who write do. I have lo-fi hip-hop playing, not too loud, it needs to be more background, but sometimes I do think about turning it off and writing in complete silence, because sometimes a song catches my attention and I write down the name to find it later. At the time of this writing, I'm doing something my brother suggested. Have only one song you like playing on a loop. So far it's working out pretty well. I do have my phone nearby, but it's very inactive. Surprisingly, I largely forget about social media when I'm writing. It's difficult for me to write on my desktop, instead I use my laptop for my couch. I only wish I had a more comfortable couch and an ottoman. Right now I'm putting my feet up on a table and the couch is made of leather, a material I am not fond of. But hey, I got it for free. One man's trash. The bottom line is, whether you're a writer or anything else, do what you have to in order to find what maximizes your potential. Chris Avellone has not played The Outer Worlds yet. He says that he absolutely supports it, but it was the Epic Games Store exclusivity deal that turned him off. He says that Steam should have competition, but he felt that the deal wasn't based on what's best for the game. It was someone trying to control the market, he says. Steam should have a competitor, but this wasn't benefiting gamers and players, just a company, and that bothered him. It felt that way to me because it was just pressuring people to use Epic Games Store, even though we knew the platform was inferior to Steam and GOG. Exclusivity deals is a good way to get people to try out your product, but that's a means to an end. The end being so that people can discover what makes your product better, what it does that Steam doesn't. For a developer, it was a better cut of the profits. For the consumer, It was nothing. It appeared as if Epic wasn't even trying to make a better product, so people felt like they were being forced to use eggs, an inferior product, and it was not appreciated. He doesn't have an Xbox, so no Game Pass. He decided that he wants to play it, but concluded that he wouldn't mind waiting a year. By then, the bugs would have been ironed out, quality of life improvements would have been made, and any DLC would probably come bundled. And I personally would love to see a poll conducted, or the sales figures for when it does release on Steam. How many people chose to wait, I wonder? Is Epic really making that much of a dent? That remains to be seen. It'd be interesting if on the day it releases on Steam, it immediately goes on sale. Epic might do that in an effort to undercut Steam, but what if Steam puts it on sale as well? I guess that's more in line with the competition we were hoping for. Working on different genres and being typecast towards RPGs. I did not know this, but Chris Avellone is working on that action RPG that was announced at the Game Awards, Weird West. I feel like they should have touted that more in the trailer. There are genres that he's always wanted to work on, as well as franchises. He says that the nice thing about being a freelancer is that you're able to diversify. As a freelancer, you can work on many different games, while at a studio it just wouldn't be allowed. And that's what I've been saying. I don't remember when or where it was I first said it, maybe it was a static video. But I remember mentioning that Chris Avellone leaving Obsidian and doing freelance work might be a blessing in disguise. On the worry of being typecast to RPGs, he says that it's almost impossible to write the same tropes and the same characters if you're paying attention to the game world, the game lore, and the game systems, because they will inexorably change the way you write if you're being respectful of the world. I've heard people suggesting ideas for translating Kreia into other franchises like Dungeons & Dragons. I wonder if it's even possible. The Star Wars universe and its relationship with the Force is what makes Kreia who she is. She exists because that's the world that allows for such a person to exist. I suppose you could use her as a reference point, and you may end up with a similar character, but you shouldn't end up with the same character. Kreia wouldn't make sense in the Fallout universe, but Ulysses does. Chris Avellone's vision of narrative in games. Chris thinks that the next obvious step is to see how conversations would play out in VR. It would allow for many more elements to play a role besides just picking a response from a menu. They can incorporate parameters like whether or not the player is making eye contact, how they're standing, are they paying attention, overall body language comes into play. I think due to what I've seen of VR titles up to now, I haven't even considered this, but he's right. That would be interesting. But on a somewhat unrelated note, if it can be done right, it may even be used for individuals like myself who have issues with maintaining eye contact and expressing with or reading body language. All quite exciting to think about. This was a really good read, and I highly recommend you read the entire piece since there was a lot that I skimmed past. I'm looking forward to the other articles and the full transcript. I had never heard of playdiaries.com before this. They seem to be a largely crowd-funded platform through Patreon. We've seen where commercially funded publications have taken us. I'm not gonna name any names. You know who you are. So this might be a great idea. Anyway, I'll leave it here. Till next time, zip it up and zip it out.